I have here a good paper from a study in Italy that shows that elderly people who ate more plant protein died younger. What? I thought plant protein was supposed to extend your life. I have here a good paper showing that elderly people in Japan lived longer when they ate more plant protein. Oh, come on, science, you're confusing us. Make up your mind. Here's a very good study that showed that vegan men who supplemented with soy protein built muscle and strength at the very same rate as omnivorous men who supplemented with whey protein. Here's a good study from respected researchers casting doubt on the quality of plant protein for building muscle and strength. Oh, come on, science. If you had a sense of humor, I'd think you were messing with us.
I've got some science jokes, so...
Okay, all right.
Let's hope you understand, though.
Actually, maybe you are hilarious, science.
You've stated that you believe there could be an infinite number of parallel universes. Does that mean that there is a universe out there where I am smarter than you?
Yes, and also a universe where you're funny.
Okay. Everyone knows there are three things you can't talk about without losing friends, right? Politics, religion, and protein. But you and I are going there on protein because we have to, because every meal we eat, we make that decision. And the stakes are high. Maybe Alzheimer's, cancer, a wrecked planet. So how in the world can everyday people make sense of this? It's hard to know if even science has figured this out. And the fortunes of the beef industry depend on confusing us with behind-the-scenes shenanigans. I have a strong science background, but I'm no match for career biochemists who can depend on mTOR and leucine. Even a distinguished professor of nutritional biochemistry said in his book Whole that in 40 years of teaching it at Cornell, depending on components of food by experts was not the key to understanding human health. So what is the key? In this episode, we'll tackle three simple questions. 1, what are the best forms of protein for long-term health? 2, what's the best protein for getting us jacked like Arnold? And 3, how much protein do we need? Hopefully we can end with a conclusion that everyone can understand. Part 1, health. The first question is, how can we tell who knows their stuff about this? I think the most revealing way to pull back the curtain is to check their references. For example, the popular YouTube channel What I've Learned did a recent episode on animal versus plant protein that got 1 million views in a month. So let's just pick the first reference he cites in the first minute and see how it holds up.
And data from NHANES suggests that 40% of Americans aren't even hitting their minimum protein requirements.
The report he referenced is this 438-page USDA report, which uses the NHANES data. He doesn't say where in the report he got that quote, and you won't find it by searching the way he repeated it. It looks like he changed the quote's wording, and it's in the protein food group section. Nearly 60% of the U.S. population meets the protein foods intake recommendation. He changed the wording to 40% of the population is not even meeting their minimum protein requirements, and he eliminated the phrase food group. The critical thing is the context. The report has a specific definition of the protein foods group they were referring to. Protein foods comprise a broad group of foods including meat, poultry, fish, seafood, eggs, soy, nuts, and seeds. Dairy also contains protein, but since it has its own food group, its nutrient contributions are counted in its own group. Okay, so there's protein to be had outside the protein foods group. What does that mean? They explain it in the next 2 sentences. Although some groups in the U.S. population do not consume recommended amounts from the protein foods group, intakes of protein as grams per day are adequate across the population, and protein is not a shortfall nutrient. Notably, the protein intake also comes from dairy and grains in addition to the foods included in the protein foods group. Okay, so even the USDA, which is motivated to see you eat more beef, is honest about the fact that protein deficiency is not a thing in the US. That's a whole different impression than what you get from What I've Learned's video. It's just that almost no one checks his references. It's a great way to get rich on YouTube. Just misquote authoritative sounding references to make it sound like you can be healthy eating the foods you really want to eat. He's got 1.9 million subscribers. You don't get that by telling men to eat more beans and fewer steaks.
Never see that the other way. I will have the steak, and can you make it taste like tofu?
I think reference checking is as much about asking which ones are conspicuously missing. For example, the World Health Organization famously declared that processed meats are a Class 1 carcinogen, and red meat probably is, and they produced this 508-page report to explain how they arrived at such bold and unpopular conclusions. I'm probably the only person to find it fascinating. I mean, who were the scientists behind it and what was their evidence? Looking at the names, I recognize some of the 20-plus scientists behind it, like Paulo Vineas from Imperial College in London, who has highly respected papers about environmental influences on cancer and especially diet. When the scientists met in Lyon for a week, they invited observers and, of course, organizations like the Pork Producers Council and the Cattlemen's Association had people there. I didn't know the Cattlemen's rep, Shalene McNeil, but I know their playbook so well, I could guess. They would have found a camera-ready mom with PR savvy in some degrees who would run to the biggest TV shows possible to say the science is weak and uncertain, further eroding America's faith in science. Just what we need.
I am not surprised that you reject this study and you don't believe the science is good, but you heard the doctor say there, this is based on science.
Absolutely, and we've taken a look at these 800 studies, and what we see is that we have a weak association that's weakening over time, and about half of the time, these studies don't even find an association. So this is not a link, a causal link between red and processed meat and any type of cancer.
Was the science weak? That's why I found this report so fascinating. 800 studies and a team of very respected scientists from leading institutions around the world all agreeing that, oh yeah, processed meat is definitely a carcinogen. So why did they conclude red meat was just probable? Well, they had a fascinating observation about cooking. The amounts of these chemicals formed in cooked red meat can vary by more than 100-fold depending on the kind of meat and the method of cooking, temperature, time, and heating source. High temperature cooking by frying, grilling, and barbecuing generally produces the highest amounts of these chemicals. So if companies added now with more carcinogens to their flame-broiled commercials, the Federal Trade Commission would approve it as factual. There's a lot of heme iron in red meat. Here's what they said about it. There is strong evidence that heme iron contributes to the carcinogenic mechanisms associated with red and processed meat. Look at this beautiful coffee table book celebrating the successes and the heroes of the Cattlemen's Association over the past century. 5 points jumped out at me in this beautiful book. And the first is cattle coming over on Columbus's second expedition in 1493. The second was the opportunity they saw for cattle when the bison were gone and the Indians were sent to reservations. 3, the age of industrialization. 4, when they discovered how effective Joanne Smith could be. She was the public relations dream. She was intelligent, attractive, articulate, and tough. The national media loved her. The positive press that Joanne received was pivotal in turning the industry to the offensive in selling their product. And 5th, their cozy relationship with the politicians at the very top of government. Here's a beef industry book on how to market beef to the Japanese. Did you know they like their beef marbled, whereas Americans like it lean? And they like it sliced thin and boiled? Less carcinogenic. There are sections in the book to help them overcome their millennia of Buddhist beliefs, which made them reluctant to eat beef.
We're squished, but we're good.
So you're squished, but you're good?
Yeah.
I have another YouTube channel for an irrational passion of mine, a certain type of motorcycle. And I'm always stunned at how the manufacturers want to shower me with gear and all expense-paid trips to exotic destinations like Morocco. And I only get 100,000 views for an average review. I couldn't help wonder what it must be like to be a YouTuber who routinely gets millions of views promoting meat. So I asked acclaimed nutritionist Marion Nestle, who wrote Food Politics. How much does the food industry capture popular book authors and people on the internet? Do we even know?
Oh, I don't think we have any idea. I certainly don't. I mean, occasionally I hear about an example, but unless you hear about an individual or some investigative reporter gets a story, you have no way of knowing. These things all take place behind closed doors. I mean, we know that in the case of the Coca-Cola company, Coca-Cola got caught.
But Chris, you say, those are just social media influencers in industry. Aren't there legit scientists on both sides of the protein debate? There are, and both sides can show that their eating patterns are much healthier and better for weight loss than eating processed foods, which is 65% of the calorie consumption of most Americans. Remember the study I opened with showing elderly people in Italy died sooner the more plant protein they ate? They were getting 73% of their protein from cereals and only 5% from legumes. 99% of the cereal grains people in developed countries eat are refined. In the study from Japan, where elderly people lived longer with more plant protein, they were getting 25% of their calories from legumes. Big difference. Let's take the case of Don Lehman, pro-animal protein career professor of biochemistry, who mentored a lot of students, including popular pro-meat social media personalities like Dr. Gabrielle Lyon and Lane Norton. Lane is an acclaimed bodybuilder in addition to being a PhD nutritionist. I've watched Don's interviews and speeches, and they sometimes devolve into comments like this when talking about papers he believes are flawed, like a recent one in Cell Metabolism by longevity researcher Walter Longo, which claimed animal protein increased cancer rates.
So you think, why did they do that? I mean, there's only 3 reasons. One is they don't know how to use NHANES. 2 is they're too lazy to use the entire database. Or 3, they didn't like the entire database, so they manipulated it to get the answer they wanted. You can decide which one you think is right.
Do you know great scientists who speculate that, especially when it comes to personal motivations? The ones I know stick to verifiable data. He endorsed What I've Learned's video on Twitter, by the way, the one we reference checked earlier. His student Lane Norton appeared in that video. Fortunately for us, there are scientists whose references are airtight and who stick to the evidence. I occasionally check Red Pen's reviews of nutrition books because Red Pen are ruthless reference checkers. One of the reviewers, Seth Yoder, who has a master's in nutrition science, helped me reference check these 2 books, which completely fall apart when you check their references. So I was shocked when Seth gave such high marks to Walter Willett's book. You're so ruthless with your book reviews.
Well, I try to be ruthless.
I mean, with Gary Taubes and Nina Teicholz, your reviews were just unbelievably great. I don't know how many hours you spent doing that, but it was just fabulous and accurate. But then you come to Walter Willett's book and you turn into this pussycat.
I know, right? It was so disappointing to me. I read this book and I was like, it's too good.
Can't find anything.
I really tried to look for some things. You know, I was thinking like maybe I'll catch him with his pants down, you know, on this graph, you know. You know, maybe he cites a study, you know, and I'm like, maybe he like slightly misrepresents the numbers in it or something like that. Maybe I can get him on that. But I go back and I check the references and it's like, no, he's pretty good.
Walter has some pretty important insights about protein, like you're getting a package deal when you eat it.
What are the components of these various foods? And we know about a lot of the health effects of the various components. Here we're looking at the ratio of polyunsaturated fat to saturated fat. And we've known for many decades that higher intake of polyunsaturates reduce LDL, the bad cholesterol in our blood, and higher intake of saturated fats increase the levels of LDL. And beef has very little polyunsaturated fat. Chicken has a lot more polyunsaturates. That looks a lot better. Salmon's even better. And there's a huge difference with these plant-based sources of protein. Beef and salmon in particular have quite a bit of the precursors of something called TMAO that seems to increase the risk of cardiovascular disease. They contain a lot of heme iron. We conducted what we call substitution analyses, and this is looking at replacing one serving of protein, one serving of different protein sources, red meat, with these alternatives. And whether it's poultry, fish, nuts, or red meat, we saw lower risk of coronary heart disease. But especially strong was nuts and beans.
It's startling how closely that chart correlates with the effect those foods have on longevity. The foods on the right are the most associated with long life, and the ones on the left with the shortest. Walter ran the Harvard School of Public Health for years, and it's hard to dismiss him as a radical vegan since he promotes the Mediterranean diet. Remember Paulo Vineas, co-chair of the scientific team that produced the WHO report on red meat and cancer? He's another whose references check out.
The proportion of preventable cancer, because there are several estimates that tend to converge towards an estimate of around 40 to 50%.
He observed that meat is missing part of the package deal that comes with plant proteins, fiber, and consuming less than 23 grams of it a day is a risk factor for several cancers and serious illnesses. The current American average intake is just 15 grams per day. Some scientists observe that fiber can interfere a little bit with protein absorption, which brings me to part 2, strength.
And I did that joke, and after the show, because of that joke, this vegan guy wanted to beat me up. But because he's a vegan, he couldn't. Yeah.
Not being a PhD specialist in amino acid digestion, the biochemistry is far above my pay grade. But once again, expert opinion varies, so how do you and I know who to listen to? You have biochemists who talk leucine concentrations and claim that animal proteins are superior. And you have other biochemists who say, maybe the way to settle this is to provide actual experiments on humans to see which type of protein provides the biggest muscle gains with weight training. Remember that paper I held up in the beginning comparing vegan men to omnivores for building muscle and strength? That study was led by Hamilton Roschel, a professor of physiology at Sao Paulo University in Brazil, who has more than 200 publications and an impeccable reputation. Hello, Hamilton.
Hi, Chris.
Oh, thanks for joining.
Thank you for having me.
I can't imagine what it's like to run a lab like yours.
Yeah, it's a whole bunch of people. There are two of us coordinating the lab, me and Dr. Bruno Gualano. 70 people in the lab, between researchers, postdocs, PhDs, undergraduates.
This study was fascinating. Can you describe how that came about?
Yeah, protein metabolism has always been a field of interest. What about if you're comparing like exclusively plant-based protein sources against mostly animal protein sources in a mixed diet? So we designed this study using vegans as a model for exclusive plant-based eaters. And we wanted to make a fair comparison. As an average, the vegan diet tends to be a little bit lower on protein content. So we didn't want to compare different protein amounts in their diets. We wanted to compare only the source. So we have to make protein intake even between the two groups. And both groups were taking protein below the recommendation when you start resistance training.
And that's 1.6 grams per kilogram body weight?
Exactly. For the vegans, with a plant-based protein, a soy isolate protein, to the omnivores, whey protein. So we would assess lean mass on these subjects. We also assessed muscle cross-sectional area, and we went a little deeper and we took muscle biopsies, and we also measured the muscle fiber area of these subjects. So we had these assessments, of course, pre and post intervention. They trained with us under our supervision for 12 weeks. We did some muscle function assessments too, 1RM, this sort of stuff, maximum repetition tests for muscle strength. We managed to select individuals with very similar characteristics, equally lean. They have similar muscle masses, lean masses, and they have similar physical activity levels. So they were equally stronger after the intervention. They got more lean mass, they got more muscle cross-sectional area, they got more muscle fiber cross-sectional area in a similar fashion between the omnivores and the vegans. And the conclusion that we took from the study is that given that you take enough protein, that your protein intake is adequate when you're resistance training, the protein source wouldn't play a role in young, healthy individuals. Of course, you cannot extrapolate this to other populations.
So I wanted to ask you about a chart that you posted on Instagram from a paper that Luc van Loon published. It just shows that according to the type of food, definitely fish and steaks have the highest protein content per calorie. Mm-hmm. And then soy and peas are next, but you go all the way up to oats and quinoa, brown rice and potatoes, and you got to eat a lot of that to get those proteins. In your study, I don't know what the vegans were eating, but they were getting soy protein,
as a supplement,
on top of it, as a supplement. If they weren't getting that soy protein and they were more on the edge of quinoa and oats, I know you don't have the data. Any speculation, any hypothesis about?
I have a few considerations about the chart that you just showed. It's a beautiful piece of paper. Luc van Loon does a great job. Him and his group does marvelous work. But you have to understand that the chart is considering isolate foods again, and that's not how we eat. We evolved to provide the mixing of the foods that would be adequate for us. It's a little bit different depending on where you go, but you always get cereals and legumes and beans of some sort that are combined And this combination seems to be a pretty good one. But then again, I don't see nothing wrong with supplementing a good plant-based protein if you need to complement your diet in some way. Because we do that every day with omnivores, and nobody ever complain about it, right? You see people taking whey protein as if it was like water. You go to a gym, it's hard to find someone who's not taking a protein powder.
I edited that 5-minute segment from a 1-hour interview, so a lot of detail and context was lost, but I'll post the whole thing in a few days as a separate video. One thing that stood out to me about Hamilton's Brazilian study is he said beans and rice is a signature dish in Brazil. And I was thinking, that's got a pretty favorable protein profile for vegans. I wonder if that helped the vegans in this study just a little bit. The paper I mentioned in the beginning, which seemed to cast some doubt on plant proteins, is where the chart Hamilton and I talked about came from. The paper does say that when a plant-based protein isolate is made and the fiber is removed, the protein absorbability hits similar levels as whey protein. Of course, to get there, whey protein also goes through a similar process, eliminating most of the fat and lactose. There is some speculation about why many bodybuilders and trainers seem to be transitioning to plant proteins. They seem to be equally effective, and you don't have to worry about the small amount of lactose that may remain in whey protein concentrates or isolates. Speaking of plant proteins, Hamilton is very athletic, and as a result of his research, he seems to be going through a little bit of a personal transition.
I'm moving towards a more plant-based diet. I'm making this transition, if you want to call it that way. So I would be one of those carnivores with the bone in your hand, like chewing on the bone, like crazy amounts of meat. And I don't remember the last time I ate red meat, so I think I'm doing a good job on this.
You've probably been wondering where I am and why. It's UC Berkeley, one of the great scientific institutions, and just being here gives me such a sense of awe. And that brings me back to science in part 3. How much protein do we need? Early in this episode, we talked about that USDA report that said everyone in America gets adequate protein. But what is optimal? Hamilton has a lot of data to show that optimal is higher than the average diet for healthy people who work out. Does that mean we should all take protein powders? What about people who are old as dirt like me? And what about people who don't want to bulk up, they just want to be healthy? But that does bring me to another study you did for the elderly. So these are people on the either pre-frailty or frail people. You referenced a definition for that. You put them on various different supplement regimens, also resistance exercise, and it seemed like the only thing that mattered was the resistance exercise. Supplementation didn't seem to do anything.
The specific sub-study that you mentioned, we had 3 groups. We had a placebo group, we had a whey protein supplemented group, and we had a soy isolate supplemented group. For the placebo, of course, they stay with the 0.8 grams per kg body mass a day of protein intake. The other 2, they went up to 1.2 grams per kg body mass. After 4 months of training, they all got stronger. They all got better functionality scores. They all got more lean mass and more muscle cross-sectional area. But they got it all in an equal manner, including the placebo. That's why we say that the supplement or supplementing protein to these individuals didn't work.
Hamilton had a lot more to say about that study, which I'll post as part of the full interview. One fascinating thing is how muscle mass doesn't seem to decline linearly with age in practice. What happens is during periods of bed rest, say 10 days in duration, you lose a lot of muscle mass, and then the average aging person can only regain half of that.
This is the amount of muscle that you would lose in a single week of immobilization, so bed rest. So you're not sick, you're still eating, but you just stay in bed for a week. And this is the amount of muscle that you lose. And we believe now that the traditional view on muscle loss, like a slow, gradual decline in muscle, is not really what is happening. Those are demographic data. The reality is that people lose muscle in short periods of reduced physical activity, which they don't fully regain afterwards. And then net with every successive short period of immobilization or bed rest or illness, they actually lose muscle and don't regain it completely.
So what is the answer for how much protein we need? Well, I'm inclined to think it depends. For young nutritionist Simon Hill, whose Plant Proof podcast I greatly admire, he wants to bulk up, so he leans into eating legumes, and he eats a mixed protein powder made from plants. Endurance athletes, on the other hand, naturally get a lot of grams of protein per kilogram of body weight because they eat a lot of calories, thereby getting a lot of protein, and they weigh fewer kilograms usually. Tour de France cyclists can eat their way to 3 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight because they eat like horses, but even during the tour they lose muscle mass because they burn so many calories. So, Chris, do tell about this simple takeaway you promised near the beginning of this episode. I think it's get as many calories as you can from whole plants, lean into legumes, exercise, and if you feel that it helps, take a little plant protein powder. Probably doesn't hurt, and maybe it helps. Your mileage may vary on that one. Well, it's a couple days since I filmed that clip, and now that I look at it in the editing suite, it's like, wow, Chris, you really gave a non-answer answer to that protein powder question. Yeah, I kind of did, huh? One of the things that was bothering me is Walter Willett had a Be Wary of Protein Powders segment in his book. My take is he was targeting everyday people who don't get that much exercise and for whom the low-hanging fruit really is an improved diet. Harvard also had some cautionary notes about protein powders on their website, and so did the Cleveland Clinic in the context of giving protein supplements to children. So my take on protein powders is I'm also worried about them for the 80% of the population who's not getting a lot of exercise and is looking at them as a healthy way to make up for a bad diet. Thanks so much for watching. I can't wait to read your comments. Oh, some people are going to bring the heat, but that's okay because I love the passion.